to effectively enforce their authority over compounding pharmacies and assure the safety and effectiveness of compounded medications. The bill before us will fix this constitutional flaw by deleting the provisions that were deemed unconstitutional by the courts.
The House is not in order. Gentleman Murray Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The bill will permit compounders who wish to practice outside the scope of traditional pharmacy to register as outsourcing facilities, but those who choose to remain traditional pharmacies will continue to be regulated as they are under current law. And this gives doctors and hospitals the ability to purchase compounded drugs for their patients made in a facility that is subject to stringent FDA quality standards and oversight. In addition, the legislation offers providers and patients better information about compounded drugs by directing FDA to make a list of FDA-regulated outsourcing facilities available and requiring detailing labeling on compounded drugs. It will also improve communications and coordination with FDA and state authorities. Now, the second title of the bill establishes a uniform national drug tracing framework to track prescription drugs from the manufacturer to the pharmacy and raises the standards for prescription drug wholesalers and third-party logistic providers across the U.S. This is the result of several years of work to address the growing problems of pharmaceutical theft, counterfeiting, and diversion. The bill before us today makes significant improvements from the bill that passed the House earlier this year. Most notably, it develops a workable pathway to unit-level interoperable tracing in a decade. And I think we should all be proud of the work our staffs have done. I'd like to thank again Mr. Waxman, Mr. Upton, Chairman Pitts, Mr. Dingell, Ms. DeGette, Mr. Green, Mr. Matheson, Mr. Latta, and Mr. Griffith for their work on this bill. Mr. Speaker, the American people deserve the peace of mind to know that the medicines they take are safe and effective. The Drug Quality and Security Act is a critically important step in protecting the public's health, and I urge members to support this bipartisan, bicameral legislation. I yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, member of the committee.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of the Drug Quality and Security Act of 2013. Title II of this legislation, Drug Supply Chain Security, is based on H.R. 1919, the Safeguarding America's Pharmaceuticals Act of 2013, which I introduced along with Congressman Matheson. H.R. 1919 was passed on the floor by a voice vote on June the 3rd of this year. Title II of this bill relates to the drug supply chain, and I am pleased that a bipartisan, bicameral agreement was reached to secure our drug supply chain and protect patients. Securing our nation's pharmaceutical supply chain is extremely important, and passage of this bill is an important step forward to protecting America's families. Pharmaceutical distribution occurs nationwide and is estimated that within the United States there are more than 4 billion prescriptions filled each year. By replacing the current patchwork of multiple state laws with a uniform national standard, we're improving safety, eliminating duplicative regulations, and creating certainty for all members of the pharmaceutical supply chain. When anyone takes a prescribed medication, he or she should have a full confidence that the medication is as prescribed and that no counterfeit or adulterated drug has entered the supply chain. To protect patient safety, the bill creates a uniform national standard for securing the drug distribution supply chain, therefore preventing duplicative state and federal requirements relating to tracing. No state can impose additional and inconsistent regulations related to tracing products on the supply chain members. The bill increases security of the supply chain by establishing tracing requirements for manufacturers, wholesale distributors, pharmacies, and repackagers based on the changes in ownership. The bill also establishes a collaborative, transparent process between the FDA and stakeholders to study ways to even further secure the drug supply chain through public meetings and pilot projects. I was successful in including language in the FDA user fee law to allow hospital systems to repackage drugs within a hospital system in the instance.
30 more seconds.
Gentleman recognized for 30 additional seconds.
Thank you very much. Within a hospital system in the instance of a drug shortage. I will continue working with the hospital systems on the issue of permitting these systems to prepare batches of compounded drugs in advance of the specific physician prescription or order. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank especially Chairman Upton and Subcommittee Chairman Pitts for all their assistance in advancing this legislation. I want to thank the Health Committee staff and especially my Legislative Director, Allison Witt, for all their hard work. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would urge full support of H.R. 3204, and at this time I yield back. Thank you.
Members are advised not to traffic the well. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the Chairman Emeritus of our committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized. Without objection.
Speaker, this is a good bill. It's not perfect, but it is a huge stride forward. It represents a major step in securing our pharmaceutical supply chain, improving FDA's authority to oversee compounding pharmacies. It also is done under a bipartisan, bicameral, cooperative and enthusiastic effort by members on both sides of the aisle and on the Capitol working together. It addresses the problems of the deadly fungus meningitis outbreak of several years ago, which were traced to lots of supposedly steroid injections made at the New England Compounding Center. There were 264 cases of fungal meningitis in my home state and 19 deaths. This will address that concern in a very excellent way. It also sees to it that FDA and the states are able to cooperate together, have better funding, and more authority over compounding pharmacies. It also does something else which is very important. It sees to it that now we can track and trace pharmaceuticals through the channels of trade, a very, very important need. And it is for the first time going to see to it that Americans are able to address their concerns about the safety of pharmaceuticals in these important areas. I want to thank Chairman Upton for his leadership, Ranking Member Waxman, Representatives Pallone, Matheson, DeGette, and Latta and Pitts and Griffiths, and my good friend Mr. Green for their hard work on this legislation. I hope that we can quickly send this legislation to the President's desk for signature. And now just one thought. Why is it that on legislation of this kind, this body can work together and we are not capable of dealing with massive problems like government shutdown and dealing with continuing resolution? Perhaps maybe a little bit of informed, intelligent behavior by this House on other matters would be in order.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I would yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, who played a very large part on the compounding side of this legislation. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
Excuse me. The gentleman suspend. The chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they are here as guests of the House and that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings or other audible conversation is in violation of the rules of the House. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding me some time on this, and thank you and Subcommittee Chairman Pitts for giving me the freedom to work on this. I appreciate it very much. It has been a year since last fall's fungal meningitis outbreak associated with the tainted sterile compounded drugs from the New England Compounding Center. In my district and in our area in Virginia, we had several deaths. We had 50 confirmed cases. We had approximately 1,400 patients who were notified they could have been exposed to fungal meningitis because they received tainted steroid injections. In working on this bill, I appreciated the bipartisan manner that we used to address this and to work on this matter, particularly with my colleagues across the aisle, Representatives Gene Green and Diana DeGette, for whom I am very grateful for all of their time and effort, both by them and by their staffs. I should also thank my staff member who worked on this most, which was Adam Harbison. Having said that, in the bill, while I agree with Mr. Dingell, it is a good bill. It is not a perfect bill. But I am glad to see that language from the Griffith-Green-DeGette effort was adopted, and the FDA will be required to engage in meaningful communication with all of the states when potential problems are identified, as this has always been my priority. In my opinion, this was the biggest failure of the FDA in handling the NECC case, as they were warned about problems in advance. At least 2 states prior to this problem coming to the forefront with all of these deaths and with this horrible situation, 2 states had sent out a warning signal. The state of Colorado had said, wait a minute, we're not going to let these folks operate here, and the state of Ohio had notified the FDA that they had concerns about NECC being a manufacturer, and yet there was not any swift action taken on NECC or even an attempt to alert other states, including the state of Massachusetts, to the problems that were happening. Now, I will tell you that this bill does not change. I know there's a lot of concern out there by some in the medical community, particularly the doctors and some others. This does not change the existing law on office use, and it does not change the existing law on repackaging. There were legal questions that were involved with this situation surrounding the advertising requirements of the original bill. I was a little surprised that the FDA had waited 10 years to bring that up, but this bill fixes that problem and takes away that cloud of uncertainty as to whether or not the whole bill was not constitutional because the advertising sections were not constitutional. This is a good bill. I'm just talking about the compounding sections, but also the track and trace sections are very good. I think we are drawing a clear line, defining so that the FDA can better determine who are the traditional compounding pharmacies and who are really outsourcers or manufacturers. And I think that is great, and this bill has that in there. I would be remiss if I didn't tell a story that struck me last week, because we are on that 1-year anniversary. And am I out of time? Got another 30 seconds.
I yield an additional minute.
Gentleman is recognized.
And I would say that last week I went to have lunch with my sons at their elementary school. And the elementary school secretary said to me as I was going in, she said, I know I probably shouldn't say anything, but I want to thank you for working on this compounding bill. Doug Wingate, who died a year ago, was my family's best friend. And he and his wife were supposed to be on a cruise for their 25th anniversary, and instead we were attending their funeral. His wife last week was on that cruise with her son, but we can never bring her husband back. But this bill will make sure that we don't have that problem again, and the other Doug Wingates of the world will not have to die in order for us to change the law to make a better protected system for the American people. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from the state of Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost exactly 1 year ago, as you've heard, there was a tragic meningitis outbreak in Massachusetts. 64 people lost their lives and 750 people were sickened. In the investigation of NECC, the compounding pharmacy, there was found black specks floating in the vials. There was found fungal material. The factory itself had greenish-yellow residue on supposedly sterile equipment and surfaces that tested positive for mold and bacteria. In a series of hearings in our committee, we learned that the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of 1997 left a loophole large enough to allow large drug compounders to escape oversight by the FDA. The wording of the act also led to litigation and confusing court decisions about the FDA's authority over those manufacturers. This bill takes the first, albeit important, step to address these issues. It incorporates important pieces of bipartisan legislation, as you've heard, that I introduced with Mr. Griffith and Mr. Green. It deletes the provisions from existing law that were deemed unconstitutional by the courts. It also enhances cooperation between state boards of pharmacy and the FDA. And it gives doctors and hospitals the ability to purchase compounded drugs for their patients made in a facility that is subject to stringent FDA quality standards and oversight. Importantly, all other compounding pharmacies would be continue to be subject to current law. Finally, the Drug Quality and Security Act will require, within a decade, the implementation of a nationwide system for the tracking and tracing of drugs as they move through the supply chain from manufacturer to pharmacy. I believe this will go a long way toward preventing dangerous, counterfeit, and substandard medicines from entering our drug supply. We still have work to do. We all agree with that. And I am committed to strengthening the law. May I have an additional 15 seconds?
I yield the gentlelady additional 30 seconds.
I am committed to strengthening this law so that we never have any other tragedy that Mr. Griffith discussed, where we have a Doug Wingate who right now is missing his 25th anniversary cruise because he was killed by these tainted drugs. I'm proud to have worked with my colleagues from both sides of the aisle. I associate myself with the Chairman Emeritus' remarks that we should be able to do this on the continuing resolution and on the debt limit. And I also want to thank all of our staff, in particular my Chief of Staff, Lisa Cohen, who spent the entire August recess. And I thank the Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has started. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, Vice Chair of both the Health and the ONI Subcommittee.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chairman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, as an original co-sponsor and as a negotiator of the House legislation, I rise in the strongest support of the track and trace provisions which protect the public and give confidence to doctors in practice that the drugs they are dispensing in fact came from the manufacturer. In regard to the language over compounding, there is in fact much to like. There was additional work that could have been done, but unfortunately, due to the intransigent insistence of the Senate, we are considering these two issues together. 60 American lives were lost a year ago. Excellent investigative work was done by our Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, and it is disturbing to me personally that not one person at the Food and Drug Administration has been held accountable for their failure to use existing authorities or informing the state of what they knew. My test for consideration of new categories of regulation is that it must not impact the traditional practice of medicine, pharmacy, or compounding. Mr. Speaker, no bill is perfect. There's always the risk of unintended consequences. I sincerely hope that this language will pass this test, but if it does not, I hope that our committee and this body stands ready to do the necessary oversight and correct the consequences of unintended consequences. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased at this time to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise in strong support of the Drug Quality and Security Act. This important bill is a result of weeks of bipartisan and bicameral negotiations. I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Morgan, Griffin, and Diane DeGette, for joining me in our effort over many months. I also want to thank Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Waxman, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Emeritus Dingell, and my good friend Congressman Matheson for all their leadership through this process and their commitment to getting this final product to the floor. It was a group effort, which is how this body should function all the time. This bill is not perfect. We heard those concerns and we have tried to address them, but the nature of compromise is not getting everything. The Energy and Commerce Committee investigated last year's outbreak and found that there was breakdowns in regulation at the state and, most concerning, on the federal level. Large operators were able to sell products interstate in unregulated gray area. In the case of the NECC, their sterile facilities are far from sterile. They operated without fear of penalties and for far too long, and people died because of that. I'm proud to say that this bill fixes the problems that led to the fungal meningitis outbreak, and it requires the FDA to succeed where it failed in the past. Bad actors concerning more with profit than with public health will not be allowed to operate with impunity again. I hope the FDA uses their enforcement discretion to maintain patient access to important drugs from nuclear pharmacy, certain repackaged drugs, and drugs for office use. While I acknowledge there are problems, it is most important that we act to protect the public health. Our constituents, when they seek care, will now have the confidence that a sterile compounded product really is sterile. We must make sure another fungal meningitis outbreak is never allowed to occur again. This bill succeeds in that goal, and I'm proud to support it, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Dr. Murphy from Pennsylvania.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are here today in part to deal with the issue of the compounding pharmacies that allows the FDA to have greater oversight over interstate sales. How we got here is a tragedy. In our Oversight and Investigation Committee, we found that some 64 people died from this pain medication manufactured by the New England Compounding Center. These patients trusted that the steroids injected into their spine or their joints to relieve chronic pain was perfectly safe because of the confidence our nation's health care providers placed in the Food and Drug Administration. That drug was contaminated with fungus and hurt people dramatically. More than 700 people received these lethal injections. Today, most are living with unbearable horror of not knowing whether they will survive. They must spend weeks in the hospital, missing work, holidays, and time with family. They must take large doses of morphine to ease the pain. Each day has lived under the deadly threat of infection that could reach their brains and perhaps kill them. This outbreak is one of the worst public health disasters in our country's history, and a terrible tragedy and an epic failure. Sadly, during our hearings, it was pointed out that while the FDA was still having multiple visits to compounding pharmacies, they still told us they did not have the authority. Unfortunately, several years had dragged on, where the FDA heard numerous complaints about the problems with NECC. They told us it was too complex to act on it, but clearly it was not complex, nor was it a surprise. Neither NECC nor its sister company Ameridose were operating in the shadows. They were under the nose of the FDA for a decade. Field staff were aware of it. There were warning signs, alarm bells, flashing red lights, complaints from patients, nurses, pharmacists, doctors, pain clinics, hospitals, drug companies. And so the FDA told us they needed more authority. This bill will grant it to them. But I must say, in the context of this, when Dr. Hamburg told us often it was too complex, I applaud Dr. Woodcock, who told us they need to think more like physicians and less like attorneys. That is the right attitude. So with the passage of this bill, the FDA will have the authority it needs. But we have to also make sure that they have the fortitude to take action on any compounding pharmacy that they see not up to the high level of standards the FDA sets that all citizens expect. The Drug Quality and Security Act will end these problems, we hope, end these inspection holidays, and reassure the American public that these medications, wherever they are manufactured, and most by compounding pharmacies who do a superb job of maintaining sterile conditions, but in all cases the FDA will have the authority to make sure they have the inspections and they have the team that can go in there and take solid action when these centers do not adhere to those high standards. I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The bill before us today has two main components. We talk about the issue of the drug compounding issue and also the issue of the drug supply chain, how we can track medications through the pharmaceutical supply chain to make sure that the materials are safe and have not been subject to counterfeit medications entering that supply chain. I'd like to speak primarily about the supply chain component of the bill. That component of the bill is a product of several years of work and collaboration between a number of members on both sides of the aisle, working with, beyond members, a lot of stakeholders, the pharmaceutical supply chain stakeholders, Food and Drug Administration, and others. And this act, in part, is going to provide immediate steps to help strengthen our drug supply chain from counterfeiters and other bad actors. It also establishes a clear and defined path towards full electronic product level traceability. You know, we've seen in some recent press reports counterfeit meds can slip into our drug supply, and it's so tempting to the counterfeiters when you think that last year alone, the prescription drug market in the United States, Americans spent $325 billion on prescription meds. So this is a lucrative market, and it's very tempting for counterfeiters, and that's why it's so important we ensure the integrity of the drug supply chain. And this bill is going to work to do just that. The other thing that this bill does is it provides some needed regulatory certainty for everyone in the supply chain. establishing a national uniform standard for strengthening the integrity of the supply chain, and that's important as opposed to having each state do their own thing, because then the participants in the supply chain are going to have to do 50 different sets of rules. That doesn't make sense. And finally, the bill establishes a collaborative process between the FDA and the industry to establish protocols for taking this traceability where you can track the meds all the way down to the unit level. That's going to provide the ultimate level of security and certainty for consumers across America in the integrity of the drug supply chain. I want to thank so many people, but I particularly want to thank Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Waxman for their work on this. I also would like to thank a couple of colleagues who worked on this issue before who are no longer members of Congress, Mr. Bouyer and Mr. Bilbray, who spent a lot of time in the current Congress, Congressman Latta, and Mr. Dingell as well. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would make an inquiry. We have no more further speakers on our side, so I'm ready to close, but I'll yield the gentleman from...
We have
The gentleman
a
from
couple.
California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to our good friend from the state of Connecticut, Mr. Lauro.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I rise in opposition to the act before us. I support the track and trace provisions to prevent fake medication from entering the drug supply, and I commend the ranking member for his effort. But the voluntary approach to regulating large-scale compounding pharmacies in this bill is not strong enough to ensure the public safety in this arena. This is a life-and-death issue. Last year, one single compounding pharmacy in Massachusetts caused a fungal meningitis outbreak that sickened over 700 people and caused over 60 deaths, which is why I introduced legislation to draw a clear line between whether a business is a traditional compounding pharmacy or a drug manufacturer like the one in New England, and to ensure proper mandatory FDA regulation of compounding drug manufacturers shipping mass amounts of drugs across state lines. Under this bill, large-scale, high-risk compounding manufacturers would voluntarily register with the Food and Drug Administration without meaningful enough penalties for failing to comply. That New England Compounding Center, responsible for over 60 deaths, would not have to register. This voluntary approach will continue to expose patients to potentially unsafe, mass-produced compounded drugs that are not approved or evaluated by the FDA for safety, efficacy, and adequate directions for use. It is an approach that can do real harm, and it is time for the FDA to be the regulatory agency it was intended to be. At the very least, given that lives are at stake, the House should consider this issue as a standalone bill through regular order with the opportunity for amendments. It should not be on a suspension calendar, and as it is on a suspension calendar, I must oppose this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Yeah. Sorry. We have no further speakers.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from California.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me, and I rise in support of this compromise legislation before us today. I believe that H.R. 3204 will enable our country to further secure our pharmaceutical distribution chain and help keep patients who depend on compounding pharmacies safe. I'm proud of the Energy and Commerce Committee because concerns that many of us had about the previous version of this track and trace legislation have been taken care of in this bill. It's been addressed by this bill. And the previous bill was H.R. 1919, and we had difficulty with it. So I look forward into support of this bill. We held hearings. We are compromising on both sides. I wish Congress would take our lead on other issues and compromise, but I'm happy to support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote aye. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I just have myself to close.
The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of our time. I want to thank Chairman Upton and Chairman Pitt and Ranking Member Pallone, the Democratic staff, Tiffany Guarascio from Mr. Pallone, Greg Sunstein from Mr. Dingell, Rachel Stauffer from Mr. Gett, Lisa Cohn, Mr. Gett's office, Nate Tipton, Mr. Greens, Joel Bailey, Mr. Matheson, Karen Nelson, Eric Fromm, and Rachel Scheer. All of these people played an an essential role in getting this bill through. I want to single out Mr. Griffin, who introduced the bill in the House, along with Mr. Gett and Mr. Green, that served as a foundation for the compounding debate. Mr. Matheson and Mr. Latta introduced the House Track and Trace bill. Everybody didn't get what they wanted. This bill is a compromise. This institution has to reach compromises to get things done. We cannot have every issue litigated and relitigated. Once the law is settled, we must go on. And I am chagrined that we are likely to close the government because on the other side of the aisle, the leadership in this House wants to keep the fight going on the Affordable Care Act. It is the law. It has been affirmed by the courts. It's about to be put in place. We should work together to solve our country's problems, not make them worse by failing to compromise and work with each other. I yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of our time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation that we hopefully will pass in the next few minutes is very important. It clearly, I think, would have saved the lives of those folks that were taken, and it reflects the hard work of our committee on a bipartisan basis. From the very start, the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee went to work. We got to the very bottom of a very tragic situation that impacted some 20 states, hundreds and hundreds of people, and we've changed that system now. Because of their work and their investigation, we came back and moved legislation through the proper channels, regular order, through the Health Subcommittee and through our committee, and worked very closely with Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to craft this bill that would have stopped this awful thing that happened a year ago. Congress does work and can work when we work together. And I'm proud of this product. I'm proud of this legislation. I would urge the Senate to take it up in the next day or two so that we, in fact, can get it to the President's desk. And I thank every member who worked so hard. And we saw today the personal impact certainly on all of our districts, but the members themselves who many of us, in fact, did know folks directly impacted not only through death, but also those that were impacted because of the impact on their own lives as they still try to recuperate and survive. So I would urge all my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 3204? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Good work.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass House Resolution 2848, House of Representatives 2848 as amended.
Does the gentleman call up H.R. 2848?
We do. The Operations and Embassy Security Authorization Act, Mr. Speaker.
Amended?
As amended.
As amended. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2848, a bill to authorize appropriations for the Department of State for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to place any extraneous material in the record on this measure.
Objection.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield myself such time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of State Operations and Embassy Security Authorization Act is a measure to provide our diplomats with the tools that they need to do the job effectively, as efficiently as possible, as safely as possible. And it's been over 10 years now since the last Department of State authorization bill was passed into law. Now, in the interim, colleagues, our ability to exercise oversight and push for reform within the department has been eroded. That is why it is so essential that we get this authorization into law, because it's not good for Congress, it is not good for the department, it's not good for the taxpayer. Authorizing these programs are going to increase our oversight ability. It will improve members' ability to legislate new programs. It will save money. It will reform old programs. And when we do not authorize, as you know, departments are less accountable. They can drift. As members know, the department's findings and failings on security were laid bare in Benghazi, Libya. The Accountability Review Board, looking into Benghazi, found, and I will quote from that report, systemic failures and leadership and management deficiencies at senior levels within 2 bureaus of the State Department, which resulted in a special mission security posture that was inadequate for Benghazi and grossly inadequate to deal with the attack that took place, unquote. That was the finding. The local guard force in place to protect Benghazi was inadequate. The closure of 21 U.S. embassies in August and the recent closure of our embassy in Beirut demonstrate the continued threat to our facilities and personnel overseas. Indeed, this week, the Department renewed its global terrorism alert for U.S. citizens. And this is why this bill authorizes full funding for embassy security. One of the principal functions of the Department is to protect our facilities and personnel that are stationed overseas. The other body, our colleagues in the Senate, have also introduced legislation on embassy security, and we have been in consultation with them because we intend to have this signed into law. This legislation carries much of the same language, including language requirements for diplomatic security personnel in line with the ARB report recommendations. We need the security personnel to be able to speak that local dialect. Implementation of the expanded Marine Security Guard program, including a plan to deploy these additional personnel and station them appropriately. We need the Marines at the gate. We need to be able to guard the gate. It needs to be reinforced. Authority to protect soft targets overseas, and regulations for the re-employment of personnel to fill staffing gaps at high-risk, high-threat posts. We need that personnel to be able to get that retraining to speak the local dialect in order to help protect that facility. Importantly, this bill contains a provision championed by committee members, Mr. Radel and Ms. Rankel, which will award local security guard contracts now on the basis of best value rather than lowest cost. For our highest threat posts, we need only the highest quality security personnel, not personnel that's going to flee in the face of a threat. This bill also requires the Department to develop contingency plans for increasing security at high-threat posts. These plans must include options for deploying additional military personnel and equipment to bolster security in response to a threat, as well as plans for a rapid deployment of assets in response to an attack. We need a rapid response force to be stood up so that they can be called into action if there's a threat in this part of the world to our consulates or to our embassies. The strong emphasis on embassy security in this legislation, 2848, and the legislation that's over in the Senate, is timely and responsive to urgent needs. Working in a bipartisan manner, this bill was able to authorize full funding for embassy security while still producing a fiscally responsible product. Overall, this bill is 9%, a 9% cut from the fiscal year 2012 level, and this includes a cut of nearly 22%, that's $2.4 billion, in department administration costs. Further savings to the taxpayer have been achieved by placing a cap on pay for those personnel stationed overseas, by closing a bureaucratic loophole that allowed personnel to draw both a pension and a salary, except in the most extenuating of its circumstances, by capping the amount of paid time off for employees, and authorizing current employees to fill staffing vacancies. And by doing it that way, we negate the need to hire more Foreign Service officers. So this bill also reforms some of the core management functions of the Department by prohibiting those convicted of fraud or embezzlement or theft or other offenses from receiving government contracts in the future. The bill also prohibits funding for proposed Foreign Affairs Security Training Center unless there's an independent feasibility study that's completed and presented to the appropriate congressional committee. This bill also has strong bipartisan support. When I say strong, Mr. Engel and myself have worked with members on both sides of the aisle. We took some 11 amendments. We've worked out the differences. We got bipartisan support in the committee, and I urge my colleagues to vote for this legislation so it can be promptly sent to the Senate and then on to the President for his signature, thereby ensuring that our embassies and personnel stationed abroad are protected at a time of their greatest need. And I will reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Reserves. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 2848, the Department of State Operations and Embassy Security Authorization Act, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I want to say once again, it has been a pleasure to work with Chairman Royce once again in a bipartisan fashion. I'm very proud of what we've done on the Foreign Affairs Committee this year in bipartisan fashion, and this is just another example of it. Everybody had input. All sides had corrections. We incorporated many, many different things together, and I think we have a very, very good product. This important legislation authorizes the resources necessary to protect our dedicated diplomats and provides basic authorities for the State Department to advance United States interests and values around the world. The funds authorized in this bill support all of the State Department's global operations for less than 3% of the Defense Department's total budget. To me, that's a very, very wise investment in U.S. national security. As all of us know, our diplomats and aid workers face unprecedented threats in the Middle East, South Asia, North Africa, and other volatile regions of the world. The attack on our consulate in Herat, Afghanistan 2 weeks ago is a stark reminder of these very real dangers. The bill before us today fully funds the President's request for diplomatic security. This will allow the State Department to construct 6 new secure embassies, support 151 new diplomatic security personnel, and build facilities for 26 additional Marine Security Guard detachments. This legislation also includes a number of other provisions to better protect our men and women serving abroad, including many that were included in an embassy security bill that I introduced earlier this year. Among other things, H.R. 2848 would enhance the coordination between the State and Defense Departments in times of emergency, require security and language training for State Department employees before they deploy to dangerous locations, and improve the process by which the State Department makes security-related decisions. In addition, this legislation includes elements of a bipartisan bill introduced by Representatives Riddell and Frankel that gives the State Department flexibility to award local guard contracts at high-threat posts on the basis of best value rather than on who had the lowest bid. In the past, having to accept the lowest bids sometimes resulted in poorly trained local security forces that endangered the safety of our diplomats and development experts. Finally, this legislation includes another bipartisan provision drafted by Representatives Perry and Meng that provides additional accountability for State Department officials when their job performance is unsatisfactory. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to point out that we haven't had a State Department authorization bill signed into law since 2002, and the Chairman and I are both convinced that this is something that needs to be changed, and that's another reason we're doing this very, very important bill. In order for Congress to properly oversee the State Department's operations and activities, we need to resume the practice of passing our authorization bill on a regular basis and encourage our Senate colleagues to do the same. Again, I want to commend Chairman Royce for his hard work on this legislation, and I look forward to working with him to further improve the bill as it moves through the legislative process, again in a bipartisan manner. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, and I would add, Mr. Speaker, the author of important state authorization and embassy security laws in past Congresses.
Thank you, Mr.
The gentleman is recognized.
I want to thank, first of all, Mr. Speaker, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Elliott Engel for crafting this extraordinarily timely and important legislation. This is an important bill, and it must be passed and signed into law. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday of this week, my subcommittee staff director, Greg Simpkins, and I returned from a 4-day trip to Nigeria, including the city of Jos, the scene of recent fire bombings of Christian churches by Boko Haram, a terrorist organization that has killed thousands of Nigerian Christians and some Muslims as well. Boko Haram, like al-Shabaab, the cowards who slaughtered Kenyans in a shopping center in Nairobi this past week, poses serious and escalating threats to indigenous Africans and American personnel overseas. The Embassy Security Act, like the Secure Embassy Construction and Counterterrorism Act of 1999, a law that I authored, is designed to significantly enhance protection of our missions abroad. Specifically, that law, more than a dozen years ago, came to the floor on the heels of an al-Qaeda bombing in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam at our embassies back in 1998. I chaired the hearings following that tragic loss of life. Admiral Crowell testified, who led the Accountability Review Board at that time. But it is clear that the promised action following those earlier attacks have not been fully implemented. There are serious, significant security gaps that must be remedied more than a decade later, and the Royce bill does that. We seem not to have learned the lessons even from the terror attacks against our ambassador and 3 brave individuals in Benghazi. The Royce-Engel bill before us today contains a number of significant provisions, including necessary upgrades for our embassies and consulates abroad. Our embassy in Abuja, Nigeria, Mr. Speaker, was constructed with the upgrades recommended by earlier legislation. Greg and I saw that firsthand this week. But so many older facilities do not meet those high standards, including life-saving setbacks from roads and thoroughfares. Chairman Royce's bill will address those gaps in essential security features at our overseas posts. I'm especially appreciative that the committee accepted my amendment that I originally got passed in the International Megan's Law 3 years ago to limit to 1 year. It passed the House, never got through the Senate, but it limits to 1 year or such time as the Secretary of State shall determine appropriate the period of validity of a passport issued to a convicted sex offender. In 2008, the General Accountability Office found that some 4,500 convicted pedophiles got passports. That's every year. That's almost 50,000 over a 10-year period, the life of a passport. And they travel to places with impunity in Bangkok and all over the world, and they abuse children. Poverty worldwide has made it even more accessible because more kids now are being exploited. This will now at least give more power to the Secretary of State and the President to mitigate their travel to abuse children. This is an excellent bill. Again, I commend Chairman Royce and Elliot Engel for working in such a constructive, bipartisan way, and I thank the leadership for bringing it to the floor.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to a very senior and important member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Meeks of New York.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, let me thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for providing leadership and working together to get a bill done in a bipartisan manner. This is a bill where everybody had their input. And everybody gave some, and everybody said what was involved, and we're able to come up with a bill that is a compromise bill that's in the best interest of all of us, especially the men and women who serve us in the State Department abroad. You see that there's generally two groups of individuals that we have a huge responsibility to. Our men and women on the battlefield who are in the military. And we need to make sure that they have everything that they need for their protection and their success in their mission. Likewise, the men and women who serve as our diplomats. What huge and important jobs that they have. And we have an absolute responsibility to make sure that we give them everything that they need to make sure that they're secure so that their missions can be successful. And that's what this bill does. It looks at it, the security issue, in a manner to make sure that we give them and that our embassies are safe and secure. For example, it wants to make sure it establishes working groups to ensure that new or reopening posts are provided the necessary security measures and funding. Because you know what we had before, where some had to be closed. When we reopen them, we want to make sure that we've looked at it, we've focused, and so that they get what they need. It requires a strategic review of the Bureau of Diplomatic Security to ensure that its missions and activities are meeting current and projected needs. Tremendously important. And it authorizes the state to utilize best value rather than lowest cost for security guard contracts at high risk and high-threat posts. Furthermore, which I think is absolutely key, it gives full authorization for the National Endowment for Democracy, of which I once sat as a board member, to support the work of the 4 affiliated core institutes, including the National Democratic Institute and the American Center for International Labor Solidarity, to develop independent media, human rights protections, and other essential democratic institutions, values, and processes around the world. This is great work. This is work that will flourish democracy throughout this place that we call Earth, making it a more peaceful and better place for us all to get along. As we've seen recently, and we've come a long way in the last 4 weeks, moving diplomatically and trying to resolve issues together, if we allow our diplomats and give them the kind of protection that they need, then I believe that we can make sure that this place we call Earth is much safer tomorrow than it is today. And I thank, again, the chairman and the ranking member for the manner in which they worked to resolve and bring this bill to the floor, and urge my colleagues to vote for it.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I first of all want to compliment the chairman, the ranking member, for their hard work on this bill, for the arguments that have been presented in favor of the bill today. But it's because of those arguments that I have to rise today in grave opposition to this bill, because of a provision in this bill that could seriously undercut our nation's ability to protect its embassies. It's been over a year since terrorists attacked our diplomatic mission in Benghazi, leaving 4 Americans dead. And in the wake of the attack, the State Department's investigation board questioned the grossly inadequate security at the mission and recommended that staff at high-threat posts undergo extensive security training at a State Department center. The independent, nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, however, has called current training facilities inadequate and has said that they pose a critical challenge. The State Department has long recognized this serious deficiency and has been looking for a dedicated training site for over 3 years. In testimony before Congress this year, Assistant Secretary Gregory Starr said the capacity of the current facility cannot meet our training needs, doesn't even meet our highest threat level requirements, and at some point may not be available to us. And yet this bill on the floor of the House today specifically prohibits the Department of State from developing the center it so critically needs for diplomatic security. And make no mistake about it, it's not because of cost, it's not because of efficiency, it's because of a protection for those inadequate facilities because of the districts they're in. This is an urgent need that must be accomplished in a physically responsible manner, but it's one that this body cannot and must not delay with more bureaucracy. And that is exactly what this bill will do. America has an obligation that we have adequately trained those responsible for the protection of our diplomats and their families around the world. It's absolutely unconscionable that we are prohibiting the State Department from moving forward on the facility they need to prevent another Benghazi attack. And I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill. No vote might not stop it, but it'll send a message to the Senate to fix it in conference. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from New York. Gentleman from California.
Speaker, if I could seek time here.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I want to assure the gentleman from Virginia and all members here, Mr. Speaker, that this committee has been highly attentive to the Benghazi attack, and indeed, that's one of the reasons we're here on this bill. But if I could reclaim my time at this time, Mr. Speaker, to respond, I would like to do that.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to yield myself such time as I might consume, but to the gentleman from Virginia who spoke earlier, I would just note, if standing up a new foreign affairs training center in his district, as has been proposed, is a good use of our limited fiscal resources, then he has nothing to fear from this bill. While there have been proposals to completely prohibit such an expenditure, they are not included in this legislation. But what our bill does do is it requires an independent feasibility study first to assess whether current facilities are inadequate before we spend the better part of $1 billion on a completely new facility. Now, if Mr. Forbes is coming out against this bill, if the gentleman from Virginia is suggesting he's opposed to this legislation, then I would point out that initial estimates by the Department of State are that this new facility could cost up to $950 million and at least $450 million. I would also call attention to the members of this body that Congress has not received a copy of any feasibility studies related to the proposed new Foreign Assistance Training Center, FAST-C as it's called. There are valid concerns that the FAST-C Center is not needed and the same functions could be achieved by collaborating with the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Law Enforcement Training Facility. And further, I would point out that the Federal Law Enforcement Training Facility has quoted a price nearly 50% lower than what it would cost to build the new FAST-C facility. Now, before State moves forward, the Congress needs more information, and the Department of State needs to demonstrate more due diligence on this endeavor, especially in light of the recent facility construction debacles that we've seen around the world, including in Afghanistan. And I'd further point out that in July the State Department noted, and I'll quote from their report, ongoing serious fiscal challenges, unquote, and the need for, quote, additional due diligence in determining how to move forward with the FAST-C facility at Fort Pickett. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, there are serious questions about whether the existing DHS facility in Glencoe, Georgia, could be used at a much lower cost to the American taxpayer. We all understand the responsibility to represent our districts, but it need not, it should not come at the cost of blocking legislation that will answer the need in terms of security for our personnel overseas. And again, I would point out that this does not prohibit such an expenditure. It merely requires an independent feasibility study to assess whether or not it is appropriate. And I yield back. I'll reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to a very valuable member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, whose provision will hold the State Department more accountable, and her provision was incorporated into this bill, Ms. Meng of New York.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2848, the Fiscal Year 2014 Department of State Operations and Embassy Security Act. This bill authorizes funds for the State Department to advance U.S. interests around the world and strengthen our national security. The bill fully funds the President's request for diplomatic security, as I have long urged that it should. Importantly, it also makes several important changes to how we protect our diplomats and embassies abroad and how we ensure accountability at the State Department. Mr. Speaker, this past December, an Accountability Review Board, or ARB, was convened to assess the State Department's policies and response to the attack in Benghazi. However, under the current authorizing statute, an ARB can only recommend disciplinary action against a State Department employee where there has been a quote-unquote breach of duty, a standard which is both very high and very hard to understand. As a result, the Benghazi ARB was unable to recommend disciplinary action against even a single State Department employee. On this point, Mr. Speaker, I refer you to Section 414 of the bill before us today. It is entitled The Revision of Provisions Relating to Personnel Recommendation of the ARB. The section was drafted and inserted by me and my esteemed colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry. By making it easier for future ARBs to recommend disciplinary actions, Section 414 will ensure greater accountability and responsibility at the State Department in the years to come and help prevent future Benghazis. This effort on the part of myself and Mr. Perry is representative of the bipartisan nature of this bill, the first such bill that would pass Congress in over a decade. On a variety of issues, including the crucial maintenance and strengthening of Iran sanctions, the committee has worked effectively and constructively as our country needs it to. This is in large part due to the stellar leadership of Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, and I thank them so much for their mentorship. It is ironic that our committee stands on the verge of a significant bipartisan breakthrough at this time. Perhaps our work can inspire some much-needed reasonableness and compromise in these halls in the hours, days, and weeks to come. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California.